Hi, and welcome to Tim's Old School Perspectives. Here we go. We're 3 days from the election, and the election does promise to be a good one. We are going to be looking at the early voting results. This is found on Target Smart, which is a Democrat type of a thing that's put out so they can know how things are going in the early voting. And so we're going to let you know what's happening in the early voting in each of these 12 gray states or toss-up states that Real Clear Politics has decided are too close to call. And we're going to start out with an analysis of Nevada. Now, Nevada has long been considered something the Republicans can't get. It's not going to happen. The polls don't really look real great there. I think the best one shows the Democrats actually having a 2-point lead. But something very interesting is happening there in the early voting. With 84% of the votes in, or 84% of the 2016 total, the lead is only 0.4 for Joe Biden. This seems like a tiny lead, and it turns out to be like 3,500 votes, which is pretty much nothing. Now, we can assume that the turnout is going to be higher everywhere this time than it was last time, as we've got states already very close to 100% of their total vote in 2016 have already been cast. So I find that to be quite the interesting thing. So in Nevada, the vote is so close, and Trump has been closing each day that the early vote goes on, and now he's within 0.4%. I believe that Trump is going to overtake Joe Biden in Nevada. And I know this is a mighty bold prediction, but that's just where the early voting is showing me that this is going. It's said that 41% of Republicans will vote on Tuesday, whereas only 16% of Democrats. And that should give the Republicans a huge swing on Tuesday. So if the early voting is even close, it stands to reason that they should be able to surpass the Democrats. So we are going to turn Nevada a little bit red. And so Nevada has been turned into a Republican state. This does seem very unlikely, but the early voting does tell us a story here that this could happen. And so we're gonna go with the statistics. All right, so Arizona is the next state we're going to take a look at, with 86% of its total of 2016 votes already in. Biden has a 0.2% lead. This lead is almost completely negligible. It's just tiny. So the few votes that we get on election day there, the remaining 16 to probably 30% more votes, because the turnout will be high. It's so close there that I have to believe that the higher Republican turnout on election day is going to also turn this state red. All right, let's look at Texas. Texas, to me, does not even appear to be close. In the early voting, Trump has more than 1 million vote lead. Supposedly 95% of the vote total from 2016 is already in. There couldn't hardly be 1 million outstanding votes. This just looks like this is going to be a solid red state this time, and that's what we're going to make it. We'll give it a pretty red. All right, we'll move on to Georgia. And in the great state of Georgia, Trump is holding to a 5.4% lead in the early voting. Now, he held a pretty good lead in the early voting last time too, but he won the state fairly comfortably. And so Georgia, it's polling a little bit better now. Conventional wisdom is that Georgia will go to Donald Trump. So without much further ado, we're going to turn Georgia red. Alrighty, that brings us to Florida. Of course, Florida is the big prize. Trump's hopes really do lean on Florida. There isn't very many ways he could win without winning Florida. And in the early voting, it looks very good for the Republican. Biden is up 0.3%, or has a 17,000 vote lead. 17,000 votes in the state of Florida is nothing. That is the tiniest of tiny margins. And his lead is slipping away each day of early voting. The Republicans have been closing ever since they opened up the polls to actual in-person voting. This state looks like from the early voting that it will go to Trump quite easily. So we're just going to go ahead and turn it leaning Republican. All right, the next hotly contested state that Trump really needs to desperately win is North Carolina. And it might be a little bit trickier to tell how it's going to go. With 80% of the vote in North Carolina, the Democrats are holding to a 2.4% lead, which is a little bit more significant than what we've seen in some of the other states. However, the Democrats had a 10-point lead after early voting last time, and they lost the state by something like 3.5%, in that range. And so there was a huge swing after the early voting, and I believe that'll be the case again. And this state is going to be held by Donald Trump. All right, so Donald Trump has managed to make it to 240 electoral votes. Now we're going to mosey on up to the great state of Minnesota, the home of riots, looting, burning, all these kind of things. You would think these kind of things would turn this state red, but the early voting does not suggest that. Unless there is a really big skew in the early voting towards the Democrats, far more so than any other state, this state will not turn red this cycle. As a matter of fact, it looks like it's 1% worse in the early voting. I don't see Donald Trump winning this state. We're going to go ahead and leave it in the Biden category, as sad as that makes me to do. Just got to call it like the math tells us. We got to believe in the science. We can't just be going on wild superstition or anything like that. So we're going to stick with the numbers. And the numbers suggest that Minnesota, where the Democrats set at 15 points to the good in the early voting, I don't think that's going to be overcome. Now, that being said, there's only 48% of the vote in. And let's say all that early vote came out of Minneapolis-St. Paul. If that were the case, then yes, Donald Trump could catch up. So it's not impossible, but it doesn't look very likely, and I'm not going to put it on in the red column just because I hope that Trump will win it. It just doesn't look like he will. All right, let's head on down to Iowa. In Iowa, the Democrats have an early 6-point lead, which sounds daunting, but in the last election, the Democrats had an 11-point lead after the early voting and still got beat by about 9.5%. So there was a 20% swing on election day. Now, I don't know if there will be a 20% swing on election day this time. There probably won't, because so many more of the votes will already have been cast. However, there will be enough vote casts. The numbers suggest that Iowa will be won by Donald Trump by about 4 or 5%. This state really doesn't seem to be that close. We're going to go ahead and put that in the Republican column. All right. Move up to Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, the early voting is really, really strong for the Republicans. Surprisingly so, as we have pollsters giving Wisconsin to the Democrats by as much as 17 points, which is a complete landslide. That's an Illinois type of a margin there. But I don't think that's going to happen. This time in Wisconsin, well, let's just look at it as compared to 2016. The Democrats came out of the early voting with a 9-point lead in Wisconsin. Of course, we know that 9-point lead withered away. They gave up 10 points on election day, and now we're only 2.1% to the good in the Democrat early voting. That's not going to be enough, because 54% of the vote has been cast. That means there's a lot of vote out there. And of course, with more Republicans voting on Tuesday than Democrats, it looks like Wisconsin's going to eke out a win for Donald Trump. So we're going to give that to Donald Trump. And we're going to move on to Michigan and Motown and all the fun stuff that goes on in Michigan, the state of Great Depression. All right, so Michigan was won by the slimmest of margins by Donald Trump in 2016. And in the early voting, the Democrats had a 2.2% lead. With 52% of the vote in, this time they have a 3.9% lead. And unless all this early voting is just a Democrat feeding frenzy, it looks like to me that Michigan's going to go to Joe Biden by a small margin. And this one, like Minnesota, is not a hopeless situation. But I just got to call it like the numbers are suggesting that it'll be. And it looks like a 1 or 2% win for Joe Biden in Michigan. And remember, we're just going by early voting and nothing else. All right, state of Ohio. This looks like a terribly easy win for the Republicans. There's a 13% swing in the early voting. Last time it favored Democrats by 7. This time it favors Republicans by 6. That's a 13-point swing. And the Republicans won this state by 8% last time. This looks like a big slam dunk. I'm not even sure why this is any longer in a toss-up category. This is going to go Republican. Okay. So here we sit. Pennsylvania's left, and a couple of congressional districts out of Maine and Nebraska. So Pennsylvania is really strange to look at in the early voting. For one thing, they've cast way fewer voters than the other states, with only 34% of their 2016 total having been cast. So very little is showing out of Pennsylvania right now, but that which is highly favors the Democrats. Now, I went ahead and dug into the counties a little bit, and Philly right now is reporting a 92% to 5% in the favor of Biden. Pittsburgh is 74% to 20%. So Pennsylvania, with this huge margin for the Democrats, I'm going to, for the time being, just go ahead and give it to Joe Biden. It's not necessarily how it's going to happen. I sincerely hope that it doesn't work out that way, but it does look very possible. We got the 2 congressional districts. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to divvy those 2 up. And it does look like it could work out that way. Now, obviously, Nevada is the big ringer here, and the one that most people will say, well, Tim, I really don't know about that. And you're right, I don't really know about it either. But what we're going to say is that Nevada is going to go Republican, but if it doesn't, take those 6 points off that 275 you see up there, and guess what? We've got 269. And it does look like that could happen. But let's hope for the sake of the country it doesn't happen, and that Donald Trump goes on to win. So that's the report that I have. It still looks like Donald Trump's got this thing. So let's just keep on hoping, keep on voting, and until next time, peace out.